Okay, Prof, can you start the share screen feature with your slide?
Says it's host disabled.
Okay, let me check this one. Okay, you should be able to do it now. I just set the setting for share screen.
Okay, yeah, there we go.
Ah, great.
Okay, and let's get this. Okay, well, good morning, everybody, from Canberra, where the sun is shining, but it's not as hot as in Surabaya or wherever you are in Indonesia or Malaysia. And as Dr. Agi has said, Professor Agi, this seminar is based on research which was undertaken with two of my colleagues at the Universitas Indonesia, Professor Eko Prasojo and Dr. Rudiarto Sumarwono. So it is sort of a joint bit of work. What I'm going to do as well, I'm going to give you a bit of background, theoretical background to start with, to show how we went about this study. And then after the study, I've been asked to make a few words on public service in the time of COVID. And I'm just going to make a few comments on what has happened in Australia, what COVID-19 has meant for the public service. Okay, well, let's get started with this. We want to start with sort of right at the very basics, and that is the question of what is public administration reform? Well, there's a variety of definitions, but I've sort of gone for this one, which is deliberate changes to the structures and processes of public sector organizations with the objective of getting them to work better. I'd also, in retrospect, add changing structures, processes, and culture as well, and they're all interrelated. But the definition begs a question, which is always a question, or a number of questions, about public administration. You're trying to get the public service, the civil service, to work better, but we're going to work better for whom? Who are the people it's going to work better for? For the public servants, for the politicians, for the citizens, for the poor, for business? So there's always that question. And how many stakeholders are there? And then when you get reforms, public administration reform, are the reforms always acceptable to all? The answer to that, I'll give you in advance, is no. There will always be some resistance, some opposition to reforms. It can be more or it can be less. And we'll see that this is of high relevance as we go through the Indonesian case study. And then the question of, are we using the same reform package everywhere? Well, no, nothing like that. Everywhere is different. We do borrow from each other. We do borrow reforms. We do borrow ideas. We do borrow principles. But when we put them together, we modify the originals. We miss out some of the parts of it. And so we don't get the same reform package everywhere. Every public administration reform has its own distinctiveness. Although you could also say there are sort of related elements in reforms at particular times. So if we've got what public administration reform is, what I want to stress is about the importance of it. So PARs, we'll call it. So it has been recognized as being of vital importance right the way back to 1961, when I've got a book, a small book by the United Nations, which stresses the importance of public administration reform to implement programs of economic and social progress. The implication, or what is spelled out in the book, is that if you don't have good public administration, effective, efficient public administration, then you're not going to be able to manage your programs for economic and social progress. You're not going to be able to manage your development programs. And back then, it's acknowledged that it isn't easy. It's not something which you can just start one week, finish off a few weeks later. It's something which is a long process, I would say a continuous process, and it can be a painful process when you need a lot of reforms which may result in sort of hardship for some people or great resistance. So it's acknowledged for, this is now what, sort of 50, 60 years that it's long and painful, and nothing has changed since then. Okay, the third thing it noted was that developing countries have special problems. Or you can put another way around, developing countries have some problems which are not the same as the richer countries in the OECD. And so this is an early recognition of the environments in which public administration reform takes place in developing countries is not the same as it is, say, in Australia or the UK or Canada. Okay, but summing up all of this, or stressing the main message of this book back in 1961, I quote, "Administrative improvement is the sine qua non in the implementation of programs of national development." Sine qua non is a Latin expression, and it means essential, indispensable. So right from back then, the idea that administrative improvement, public administration reform is absolutely indispensable for the implementation of programs of national development was well established. Okay, so we move to today and try and think of Indonesia in these terms, what we have on this next slide, about what's pushing reform today. And what I can say is that most developing countries have programs of public administration reform. It's unusual to find somewhere which doesn't have public administration reform. So what we have to ask ourselves is why? Why is everybody pushing public administration reform? Well, there are a variety of reasons, some of which weren't as prominent back 10, 20, 50 years ago, but have become more prominent. Okay, the first one is to promote international competitiveness. This has become very prominent in Indonesian public administration reform, but if you go around the ASEAN region, you'll find it's one of the motivating factors for just about every program of reform. What has happened is governments have realized that in order to achieve their aims of economic growth and economic development, they need a public sector, a civil service, which is efficient, effective, works in a timely manner, and thus provides support to the private sector and creates what is known as an enabling environment for the economy to thrive. The second reason why you get pushing reform today is the push for sustainable development. This can be seen most clearly in the Sustainable Development Goals, which took over from the Millennium Development Goals. So sustainable development, a big thing in the world today when we have so many crises. A third thing, which is when democratization occurs, public administration reform is generally seen as necessary because democratization generally involves government being seen as more responsive and more accountable, responsive to the needs and the requirements of the people, the voices of the people, and also being accountable to them. The fourth one is one which doesn't really affect Indonesia, but this is in situations where administrative systems have broken down or weakened. I've actually worked on a couple of things where this is involved, once in Afghanistan with the United Nations, where the administrative system had basically just broken down, but not of relevance here. And then to pursue good governance. Good governance is often given as a reason for reform, public administration reform, and in a very circular way, good public administration is seen as an element of good governance. So good governance, a component of good governance, is an efficient, effective, responsive public sector. And then a simple one, to satisfy citizens. Citizens want good services. Citizens want services to be available. They want more accountability for the delivery of services, more assurance on that. So these are a combination of these reasons is what pushes reform today. Most of them are evident to a greater or lesser degree in Indonesia and probably elsewhere in the ASEAN region. And then just a final general thing before we move on to the case study, we can just ask the question, well, what are the types of reforms? I'm not going to go into details here, just to say that there's a very, very big menu of possible reforms. There are many activities that can be reformed, many items on the menu, lots of choices. And these are generally mixed together in any overall national public administration reform program, and you'll get different combinations in different places and different interpretations of these. And so just a few of them here, of the most common ones: restructuring public services, public sector organizations, eliminating red tape, that's all these sort of rules, regulations, streamlining, as it's often called, human resource management, making what is sometimes called making it strategic, linking it more clearly, aligning it more clearly to the objectives, the aims, the goals, the vision of organizations, making it less bureaucratic and more merit-oriented. Service delivery, very important, lots of variations on innovations for service delivery. Performance focus has become a major thing across the world, derives from new public management, which we'll see later, but the idea of managing performance is very strong in most countries. It's also, I might say, often very difficult. And then e-governance has become a sort of a great pursuit of countries throughout the ASEAN region and beyond, because it's seen as making government more accessible to population, citizens, and participation, where people participate in determining what the reforms are, judging the reforms, and so on. Okay, so what we have here just gives us a sort of glimpse of the sorts of things which we might get, but there are many more. Okay, now we'll move on to the case study. And the case study of Indonesia. For this first slide, you will know already, I think, most of you. But what I need to stress is the size of Indonesia in a variety of ways. First of all, population, 264 million population. That is very, very big in global terms and in regional terms. It covers a large extent, 3 time zones. It's big distances, 5,000 kilometers from east to west. And it's a big economy. Might not have the sort of up in the top GDP per capita, but because it's so big in terms of size, of population and geography, it's the 16th largest economy in the world and predicted before COVID, I have to say, to rise to the 7th by 2030. So moving upwards all the time. Okay, And the other big thing, the other big feature in Indonesia is a big bureaucracy. 4.5 million public servants plus honoraire, and that's a lot of public servants. I live in the capital of Australia, in Canberra, and it's the centre of the public service, the national public service. And I think we've only got about 70 or 80,000 public servants here. So 4.5 million is huge. And then with the bureaucracy, what has come to pass is that its reform has come to be seen as essential for national development. Now, I want to just make a little point here about the term bureaucracy. Like many terms in the social sciences, bureaucracy can be a bit confusing. Bureaucracy can mean, on the one hand, a type of organization. On the other hand, it can mean the public service, the civil service. And it can even, on the other hand, be used as a term of abuse, sort of where, say, you're too bureaucratic, and used as a critical term. But remember, especially, the difference between bureaucracy as a mode of organizing, and that could be organizing the private sector and the public sector, and bureaucracy as the public sector, the public service. Okay, it's important, and I'll remind you of this as we go along. Right, so now we're going to do this study, or I'm going to tell you about this study of Indonesian bureaucracy, and here I'm using it in the sense of the public service, in that sense there. And so what we need as social scientists is we need tools to help us do the analysis that we're going to do. So we need to get some tools together to find our way through all the data which we collect. Because you collect data, and unless you have some way of organizing it in a systematic manner, well, it's just bits of data. It doesn't make much sense. Okay, so what we've done is we've gone to a construct which is known as the ideal type, which was invented by Max Weber probably about 100 years ago now. Yes, 100 years ago, easily now. But it is a useful type thing for classifying and sorting out information on a phenomenon as it comes in. Now, it's a touch confusing in the sense that what Weber did was construct an ideal type bureaucracy. In his bureaucracy, he was talking about a type of organizing, a mode of organizing. And so what he did was take out essential elements of the organizations, of the dominant type of organizations of the day, and put them together in what is known as an ideal type. Now, here's the confusing bit. The ideal type that Weber described doesn't actually exist in reality. It's a mental construction. It's put together bits and pieces of observations to create this ideal type of bureaucracy. Now, you might say, well, why on earth do we do that? What's the point of creating something which doesn't exist? Well, the reason we do is because it enables us to compare reality. So we can compare Indonesia's public administration system with ideal types, with the ideal type bureaucracy, with other ideal types. So what this does, so it allows comparison. It allows us to say, well, how near is Indonesia to this ideal type? How near is Indonesia to that ideal type? So it enables us to analyze, to sort and to analyze. That, incidentally, is a picture of Max Weber there. Okay, what we ended up with, what we did is say, right, let's see what ideal types we can find which might apply to public administration in Indonesia. So to understand the nature of bureaucracy in Indonesia, where the reformers are trying to take it, and what progress is being made. Okay, so what we came up with were 4 ideal types. First of all, a patronage model of public administration. Secondly, old public administration model. And third, new public management. And fourth, and finally, new public service. So here we have 4 types of public administration. So what can we use them for? Well, we can use them to describe public administration in Indonesia at any one time, to identify reform intentions, to identify what the reformers are trying to transform the bureaucracy as it is today into what they want it to be tomorrow. And then we can also establish what's the success, what's the level of success in this venture to reform. One thing, just as a note before we get into the models, is that what you're likely to find is not any pure model, not just one model. You're likely to find a hybrid which may even comprise of 3, 4 types, 4 ideal types of greater or lesser strength. So some might be dominant, but a few others might be present there as well. So this enables us to identify where the public service is, where it's going to, and other things. Okay, so our 4 ideal types of public administration. The first one is patronage, and this has its origins in the kingdoms of pre-colonial Java, where patronage and patrimonialism were very common and organizing principles of the state. Patronage is, I'm not going to go into the anthropological details, but it's a vertical relationship which suggests an imbalance of power between the patron who has more power and the client who has less power. But the client still has some leverage over the patron. What happens in a patronage relationship? There's an exchange of resources between patrons and clients. For instance, clients exchange loyalty for support, protection, advancement by the patron. So the patron controls the resources which can protect a client, which can advance a client's interests. Okay, now we go to more modern times, and under President Suharto and the new order, the system of public administration, indeed governance more generally, was described regularly by academics as being patrimonial, where, as I quote there, the state is treated as an extension of the property of the leader. And what it sort of was, that it was depicted as complex webs of patron-client relations which stretched from the presidential palace in Jakarta right the way down to the Kabupatens in the outer islands. Okay, and as I say there, the leader pays off clients for support. Okay, so the leader pays off clients for their support. Now, today, what we found was, yes, it's still very evident, but certainly not dominant. We do find patron-client relations, evident, yes, dominant, no. The second type of ideal type is old public administration. And with this, we go back again to the new order and President Suharto. At the end of President Sukarno's rule, that's to say 1960, the public service was only 303,000 people. That's all. In Indonesian bureaucracy, 303,000, and think it's 4.5 million today. So you wonder how 303,000 actually managed to run the country, or maybe it was a bit chaotic. Okay, what Suharto did was develop a large bureaucracy. And it was largely or roughly modeled on Weberian lines, like the Weberian ideal type bureaucracy. That is a hierarchy of office, formal division of labor, that each level, each post did particular things, had certain responsibilities and authorities. It was supposedly appointment on merit, and then you had career progression up the hierarchy. So these were things that you found in this sort of old public administration model, the ideal type. Now, if we take the Weberian ideal type and compare the Indonesian experience and indeed the experience of various other countries which I've studied in Asia, you always see that what we call bureaucratic pathologies develop. That is, problems develop. It diverges from the original ideal type. So with Indonesia, we find that there are problems in, for instance, there is slow decision making. There's focus on process and not results. There's seniority rather than merit promotion, and so on. So we find there are problems that you get with the development. So it's not the pure type of Weberian bureaucracy is old public administration. It's a mixture. It formally looks like it, but practically in implementation, there are problems which the way it operates. So where does that leave us? Well, what we found was the dominant mode of public administration in Indonesia is old public administration in combination with patronage. So a hybrid between the dominant mode of old public administration and patronage. So that's what the reformers faced. And indeed, it's still what the reformers face. Now, moving on to the newer ones, and these are the challenges. These are the challenges to the older models. The first is new public management. And I don't want to go into the details of new public management. It's all I'll say is that new public management is something which derived from especially Anglo-Celtic countries, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States. And what it was it was a neoliberal invention, and it was the application of market principles and private sector techniques. So it looked to the market for ideas about how to run public administration and imported private sector techniques into public administration. So you get things like downsizing, greater discipline in resource usage, performance management, all sorts of performance measures and standards. And then we had, another one is decentralization within organizations, what they referred to as often let the managers manage, i.e. you say to a senior manager, your department, your section, here's your budget, you've got to live within that. You organize that, flexible. So this gave a greater degree of control to the managers, but it also meant they had greater levels of responsibility and accountability for results. So new public management is an emergent model of reform for Indonesia. And it's certainly true that reformers want elements of NPM, and we can see elements of NPM in what has been going on, what has been proposed, and what has happened. And then finally, we have the new public service. This is this is a bit more difficult to define. And it's what we call a post-NPM paradigm. So it came after NPM. There was quite a bit of disillusionment with NPM. And so this came over from various authors to see, well, what about this as another paradigm? Okay, what we can say is there's various authors have written about it, but there are some common elements. And what I see especially is a focus on service delivery. An emphasis on efficiency, effectiveness, and responsiveness in service delivery. A concern with improvisation and creativity. Not one size fits all, but that there are many sizes. You improvise, you are creative, you are encouraged to use your creativity. You look for alternative service delivery channels, collaboration with others, co-production as it's sometimes called. Then having people who are professionals. People in the public service are professionals. They're qualified, they're able, they can do the things that is required of them. And fitting solutions to circumstances, this is about adaptability. It's about the ability to analyze situations and find what is most appropriate for this situation. Okay, and this is, again, new public service, part of the reformers' emergent model. Right, now having set up the framework for this, let's have a look at the experience. Right, we've divided the public administration reform into 3 periods. The first 2 are relatively minor. It is the third, which is the big one. So let's get this first stage. This was 1998 to 2003. It's in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis, the AFC, and democratization. So we have the Asian financial crisis, we have democratization, and then there's no strategic plan by the new incoming government for bureaucracy reform. It's not there as a priority in their plans. There was focus on the politics of reformasi, democratization, consolidating democracy, and implementing decentralization. These were much more important political aims, which meant that bureaucracy reform didn't come into the priority list. There were some new public management reforms imposed by international financial institutions, IFIs, such as the World Bank, the IMF especially. Things like reducing subsidies, bit of privatization, a familiar range of neoliberal impositions, but no civil service reform. So the dominant model of public administration prevailed. The old public administration patronage model. There wasn't any real change. Now, we move to the second stage, 2002 to 2010. And this is when we do start getting into serious reforms. And but in this era, it wasn't reform of the whole public service, civil service. It was reform of certain targets. The reformers targeted at certain institutions. Why was this? Well, the reform pressure for public administration reform came from the international financial institutions. They were very interested in it, especially in the financial sphere, and from international business organizations. But also there was a very strong domestic coalition ranging from business, big business in Indonesia, right the way through to civil society that wanted to see reform of public administration. So in this period of targeted reform, we can pick out 3 major targets. The first was the Ministry of Finance under Sri Mulyani, and the second was the Anticorruption Commission KPK, and the Supreme Audit Institution. When we started, post-Suharto, the Ministry of Finance did not have a very good reputation. It was seen as being inefficient. Also, parts of it were seen as being the hotbeds of corruption. But a Ministry of Finance is one of the core, if not the core institution of the government, of any government. To have a Ministry of Finance that works efficiently and effectively is essential for development. So the Ministry of Finance was the first cab off the rank, the first institution to get the attention of the reformers with the strong support of international assistance. It did a variety of reforms, performance management, new operating standards, anti-corruption, training, some familiar things, but it was generally quite successful in improving what it seems the efficiency, effectiveness of the Ministry of Finance. They also used the balanced scorecard technique to establish and maintain and improve standards as well. The Anti-Corruption Commission, well, there was great concern within Indonesia, especially about the levels of corruption post-New Order. And so this was a priority under a democratic regime. And it was also build up trust in organizations. So the idea here was that anti-corruption would both root out corruption, but would also help to establish trust, by doing that, trust in government and the law. So again, that sort of worked well, developed a reputation for integrity and independence. At that time, of course, there's been changes most recently, and we'll see how they go. Finally, the Supreme Audit Institution, BPK, again, that existed under Suharto, but it was a weak organization which was subservient to political interests. But in a democracy, an audit institution, a strong audit institution, is essential and seen as the most important part of the state, of holding government accountable to the citizens. And so a lot of resources were ploughed into the Supreme Audit Institution. It was strengthened legally. I think it went from 1,000 auditors to 3,000 auditors. The sort of levels of training, skill levels, and a lot more. And it even became a model which certain other countries looked at to work out what they could do with their audit institutions. I might just add that one of the things which is also evident in this was that there were sort of salary supplements were part of this targeted reforms. So the idea of reform was sweetened, and people perhaps were more interested in it because of the fact they would get increased financial remuneration. And so that helps with reform. But whether you could do that across a whole system is difficult to know. So those reforms drew on a variety of things: new public management, new public service, and even from old public administration. So that's it. But now we go to stage 3, and this is where things really started happening. This was the idea that what we had to do was to make what we call a discontinuous change. We had to make a real transformation, or the Indonesian government wanted to. And so this was, as I say, discontinuous change. The President Yudhoyono shared the concerns of the citizens about bureaucratic inefficiency, poor performance, KKN, and not pursuing public good. He was greatly concerned that government was not working effectively and efficiently for the public good, for the citizens, for all stakeholders, well, for business, for people in general. So what his answer was to elevate bureaucracy reform to the highest policy level. It became a high policy priority. It hadn't been a high policy priority before. Under targeted reform, it was something which was done to particular organizations or the creation of a particular organization. But this was to say, right, now we want bureaucracy reform across the whole of the civil service, the whole of the bureaucratic apparatus. Now we want to reform. And the vision was of, and I quote here from the president, a world-class bureaucracy by 2025. So this was 2010, and so the idea was in 15 years, Indonesia would create a world-class bureaucracy. So what was in this? And so a grand design for bureaucracy reform was produced. And the aims including increased attention to performance management, right-sizing, the numbers in the public service, civil service was seen as being too large, too many people there. Rational personnel allocation, the way personnel are allocated didn't make good sense in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. There was sort of allocation didn't make rational sense in many ways. This organization had this many, this organization that, this counterpart. So that was the rational personnel allocation. A cultural revolution away from the idea of just following process to one of obtaining results and of satisfying customers, we might say, or citizens. So away from this concern with just following process to one in which it was about getting results and satisfying citizens. Another issue which was part of this whole grand design, or at least the early part, revision of laws and regulations. As you know, there are innumerable laws and regulations in Indonesia governing the public service and the operation of the public service. And the idea was to review some of the basic ones, revise them, and also try to, if possible, sort out amongst all of them, what could go, because some conflict with each other, and it's quite difficult to know. And then, of course, a major one, and one which could not be avoided, to address KKN. So this was the start of bureaucracy reform. Now, the roadmap they produced divided reform into 3 5-year phases. So it was 15 years, 3 5-year phases, and each phase was supposed to have a different stress. This has sort of been, I think, in retrospect, not quite as clear as was intended from the start, but then one does adapt and one does modify. But the idea was phase 1, 2010, 2014. Okay, what do we look at? What do we focus on? Clean corruption, or clean government, and a corruption-free governance. So basically trying to eliminate, to reduce KKN, so you get corruption-free governance. Second thing, improve services. So improve the services that are delivered to the citizens of the other organizations of the country. To improve the capacity of the public service, because it was recognized that perhaps the qualifications of many public servants were not those which were necessarily appropriate to the demands of the present. And so we needed to improve capacity, their capability to do the jobs which were important now, not to do the routine work of the past, because you're trying to change the public service to something else, and so you need people with particular capacities. Okay, its importance was emphasized by coordination of public administration, or bureaucracy reform was coordinated by the vice president. This gave evidence of the importance attached to it. However, it was rather slow to get underway. Didn't move very fast. And then once it did get going, there was slow progress. And in this era, this first 5 years, one can say there was limited achievement. And it's one thing, and it also emphasized, it's one thing to draw up plans and nice sort of flow charts, but then you've got to implement them. And the implementation was what was slow and limited progress. Okay, so what were the ideas in there? The ideas were a combination of new public management and new public service. Now, we moved then, President Jokowi presided over phase 2. This was 2014 to 2019. And what did we see here? Well, the first thing was increased attention to performance management. Initiatives in performance management across the whole of the civil service and down to the kabupatens and kotas and provinces across Indonesia. Performance management was a big thing, or became a big thing. Second thing, the focus, there became a special focus on the economy. It became very important for the civil service, the public service, to assist to enable the economy. So try to help to improve the competitiveness of the economy of Indonesia by streamlining processes, by enabling companies to get permits and permissions more easily, to make investment an easier thing overall. Okay, then trying to better integrate budgeting and planning, because there seemed to be a separation between the two, yet it always makes sense to have planning and budgeting more closely aligned, because if you're planning, you've got to take into account budgeting. And so if they become too far separated in the organizations of the state, then you can find that you get disjunctions, they don't fit necessarily. Okay, also some minor HRM changes were introduced. And then Law 5, very important, of 2014, the state civil service apparatus. And this was addressing HRM. And this was sort of trying to move from a bureaucratic style of personnel management to a much more modern human resource management system, where the emphasis was on performance, the emphasis was on achievement and merit and integrity as well. Right sizing stayed there to get organizations to the right size. And then also the idea of public service malls, or what we often call elsewhere one-stop shops. And finally, the promotion of e-government. What you had here was a combination of NPM and NPS. It was a concerted attempt to break with old public management and patronage, a very concerted attempt to do that. So NPM and NPS. So let's move on to see what we can say happened when we look back now. Okay, what I want to do here is use a model which is called force field analysis. And in force field analysis, this is a simple model invented by a guy called Kurt Lewin decades and decades ago. But it has been a very influential model in the whole organization theory of change management. Organizational change management has used this a great deal in various forms. Okay, so what have you got there? You've got driving forces, they're well, you've got to imagine there is a force field in which we're operating, in which the reformers are operating. And they're the driving forces. So the people promoting NPM and NPS, which is what they want to sort of get as the reforms, they're the driving forces. However, they encounter the restraining forces, and the restraining forces are old public administration and patronage. So what happens is the driving forces run into the restraining forces, and you get what Lewin said was a quasi-stationary equilibrium. What's down there as status quo. So they're there opposite each other, but we're not moving too fast. And you can see on the right-hand side of the diagram what is the desired state. So the driving forces are trying to get to the desired state, but the restraining forces are keeping them from doing that. Okay, so all of you will probably be familiar with the idea of, from Star Wars, of May the Force be with you, which is repeated many times in the many versions of or episodes of Star Wars. Okay, what we can say is the force for reform has not been strong enough, though, for the reforms to provide a world-class system of public administration by 25. It just won't happen, and that's even before the COVID-19 pandemic. So the forces for reform have not been strong enough to be able to prevail over the forces against. What has happened in the bureaucracy reform is you've had attempt at what I said earlier, discontinuous change, which is reactive and transformational. So trying to really transform, to recreate the public service, not to make small incremental changes, but to recreate the public service. Now, such change is always disorienting and challenges the status quo. It's disorienting because it's major, because people don't know what is happening. They don't understand what's happening. They want to resist because they see their self-interest being challenged. They see them possibly down to practical things. Am I going to lose my job? So you get resistance. Now, in the Lewin model, the force field model, you say you have the first phase of change is where you unfreeze the old system. Well, stakeholders in the system have been unwilling to unfreeze, and another term, to unlearn the old ways. So unfreeze the old ways and unlearn the old ways. So what has been achieved? Well, you've certainly had changes in the public service, and you've had sort of more change than for a long, long time, but they're incremental changes. They're small gains, maybe a lot of small gains, and so we can be sort of happy with that, but you haven't had what the grand vision set out in the beginning. So you've had what we call in organizational theory, tuning and adaptation. So yes, there has been progress, but it's not enough to make that world-class system, which requires a transformation. Okay, the problems that are being encountered, well, an aversion to change in bureaucracy. That people don't like the idea of an uncertain future, that they like the state for whatever reasons, they prefer the status quo to the unknown future. Public service as a bureaucratic organization is risk averse. There's low interest in and culture for innovation, that there is this risk aversion built into it. Third thing, process orientation. Still very much an orientation to processes rather than results. Prevalence of KKN despite concerted efforts, so it's still there. Progress has been made, maybe in various places, various organizations, but it's still there. legal blockages to reforms there, and the silo mentality, meaning that government agencies sort of think in terms of their own organization, not in terms of cooperation, not in terms of whole of government, not in terms of flexibility. It's sort of, this is our area of operation and the rest of you keep out of it. E-government has made progress, but it's still lagging behind neighboring countries. If you look at, say, the Philippines or Malaysia or even Vietnam, you find that there's been lagging behind neighbors there. And that part of that is a silo mentality of trying to get platforms which can go across the whole of government. Okay, HRM is the key to all reforms, human resource management. And there has been some achievements in this, but it's not very many. Some might ask the question at the bottom there, is it about the size? Is it because Indonesian bureaucracy is so big? Is this sort of really the problem and not these other things? Well, our sort of analysis suggests, yeah, size and fragmentation across a huge archipelago of islands is problematic because it creates challenges of how you can coordinate things, how you keep things together. But it's by no means the principal reason for slow reform progress. Okay, so in conclusion to this, there have been small wins. So we've got that. And in models of organizational change, some of the dominant models of organizational change, small wins are seen as the precursors, the things you need to start with before you get to the transformational change. But we've still got to get to the transformational change. Undoubtedly incremental progress. Yep, small steps have been made and quite a lot of them. But despite a powerful coalition, again, something talked about a lot in models of organizational change, a powerful coalition promoting public administration reform, headed by successive presidents. The forces of transformation, NPM, NPS, haven't been able to overcome the forces of resistance, the old public management and patronage. So going back to our 1961 comments by the United Nations, we're still undoubtedly in for a long haul in public administration. What needs to be done? Well, still need to build the forces for transformation. And one thing is, which has been recommended, and I agree with, is the need to sell transformation, to need to make it more attractive to the bureaucracy, and also enlist public support for transformation. So if you can sell it better amongst the bureaucracy and you can enlist public support, then as we have in Star Wars, the force may be then with the reformers. Okay, now that's that is the end of the presentation on Indonesia. But I was asked to make a few comments on public service reform and COVID-19. So I'll be very brief on this because I realize I've gone quite a way over. So in Australia with COVID-19, now, first of all, remember Australia is a federal country. And so what I'm going to talk about is the national government as distinct from the state governments, because the state governments are separate. And so I'll focus on what the national government did, okay, or has done. Okay, one of the things that the national government did was bring out a list of COVID-19 safe working principles, safe workplace workplace principles. These apply to both public, private, non-governmental sectors, but the Australian Public Service Commission, they insisted that these workplace principles, COVID-19 safe workplace principles, should be applied in the public sector, and that involved worker safety, consultation with workers, and we'll see how that goes. It also notes about when it goes back to the new normal, it's going to be an adaptive process which may vary between organizations. Okay, the Public Service Commission produced various circulars advising public servants and their bosses on social distancing, remote workings, remote meetings online, and various things. And indeed, many public servants left the office and began to work remotely from home. For instance, the Australian Tax Office, which is situated, well, not situated up the road from you now, the Australian Tax Office, 11,000 workers now work from home remotely. It can be flexible though, so some organizations have had less remote working than others. One organization, a cultural one, which my youngest son works for, he does 1 week in the office and 1 week at home, as do other people. And so they've sort of staggered, they've rostered people, so you get half of the workforce in at once and half the next week. It's varied between agencies. There's some agencies which have found it difficult to lay off, sort of to get people to work remotely because, especially of security issues in some, like the Department of Defense there. So you still see large numbers of cars in their car park, whereas others have been able to put enormous amount remotely. So another thing which occurred is that to manage surges, some agencies got more work to do, considerably more work. And these were an organization called Services Australia, which is really the central welfare organization of government. And the Department of Health and the Australian Tax Office, which had to deal with various financial aspects of welfare for people. And so you had surges in the workloads of these organizations. So what they did was deploy people from other organizations. They got volunteers from other organizations to go and work in these organizations, Services Australia especially, because of course thousands and thousands of people were put out of work and applied for welfare payments. Casuals were also hired, and there was flexibility within organizations. They changed their sort of structures and things temporarily, at least, to cope with the surge of people applying for welfare or for whatever within health, the COVID challenges. Now here the restrictions are gradually being lifted. So questions are being asked about what the new normal is. Well, the Public Service Commission says that each agency is different, and returning to the way things were before, well, maybe it'll happen, but then it's going to be according to the circumstances of the organization and still could be experimental. So will we sort of still see a lot of remote working? Will this perhaps lead to decentralization? Will we still sort of, will we be doing lots of meetings online as happens now? Will it, we just really don't know what the effect of this is. But bureaucracy has carried on in Australia despite this huge numbers of people working from home. That raises an issue in itself. If you're working from home, you're therefore providing the office space to work. So your employer is not providing office space. Also, are you provided with the hardware, the computers? In some cases, yes, but I think maybe in some cases people have had to utilize their own computers. I'm not quite sure on that but I can't see how they would have that many laptops or things in these organizations. So that raises a question of costs there. Are you supposed to provide your own equipment and provide your own space to work if you're working remotely? It's the public administration reform as a deliberate policy has largely ceased. But then once we do get back to a new normal, then undoubtedly public administration reform will be back in the spotlight and things will be happening there. And meanwhile, they froze salaries of public servants for a year as well, at least in the first instance. So no pay rises at all. Okay, well, I've gone on long enough now, going on for an hour, so I'll stop there and hand over to the other presenter. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof Turner, for the enlightening presentations. May the force be with you, Professor, and may the force be with you too, all the participants.
Thank you.
So Prof Turner has covered a lot of things. First of all, she mentions about 4 kinds of ideal public administration and give us some perspective somehow why we have been so stagnant with patronage and all public administration ideal, despite the incremental changes that happened in the last few years. He also mentions 3 phases of bureaucratic reform in Indonesia. The first is a sporadic change, that change after the fall of New Order regime, and then targeted reforms that mostly led during the President Yudhoyono's period. And the last one is the change from President Yudhoyono to President Jokowi until today. So I believe he has covered a lot of interesting presentations. So maybe, is there any of you who wants to ask questions? We will continue to the second session on 11:30 now. So we begin first with the question session, Q&A session. Please raise your hand if you have ask questions. Okay, I see from the chat there is a Mrs. Farida Hanum. Yes, you can ask questions.
Yes. Hello, Mr.
Yes.
Mark Turner. I would like to ask you one thing. From your point of view as a person who really observe about the developing country, either it is OECD or particularly in Indonesia, how much changes that is happening in Indonesia during the era of Mr. Yudhoyono and also Mr. Jokowi up to date? Because we are targeting 2025, but it's in 2020, how much is the difference, especially for the public administration? Thank you.
Okay, that's a question from Mrs. Farida Hanum about the progress has been made by the President Jokowi's administration. Is there any questions again? You can raise hand, yeah? Raise hand with the feature, yeah? Not raise hand manually like this because I cannot see you because there are 200 participants right now.
Sorry.
Okay, maybe while waiting, maybe I will give to Prof Turner to answer Mrs. Farida questions.
Okay, I can't give you a precise measurement on how much progress. One can say, I think one can say that there has been progress under both presidents. The emphasis has changed with President Jokowi more to the enabling environment for business as a priority, but there have been gains undoubtedly in a variety of areas. Then, of course, there's the other thing is to look at public administration reform or performance from the bottom up. And one can find examples of kabupaten and kota where you have had innovations and changes which are perhaps more profound and greater than in the national government. But of course, if you're in sort of the daerah, you still have to abide by the national rules. So it's rather difficult to sort of put a precise, well, it's impossible to put a precise thing on it. But you do have, I mean, if we said, what sort of gains have we made? Well, the sort of gains we've made are, there are less rules and regulations, red tape, confronting business and slowing down approvals of this, that, and the other. So we have speed, the processes have been speeded up. Then also we can say efforts have certainly been made to try and measure performance of organizations and to measure them precisely. The interesting thing there is that how far does such measurement lead to changes? How much leverage does such measurement have? And that's what I'm not clear on. The idea in performance management, obviously, is that you improve your performance. You measure your performance and you try to make it better. But I'm not clear about the performance management tools that have been used, such as the SACIP, that how far they lead to improvements. Now, you can say, well, they do in the sense that all organizations realize they have to fulfill these, they have to do these, and there is a degree of accountability for them. But does it spur them to reform? That's what or just to satisfy the requirements, which is a very bureaucratic thing where, you know, if we go back to no, I'll say one more thing, I don't want to go on for too long. The area where there has been limited progress, some progress, is in human resource management. It is the area where the most resistance, should we say, has come. And it's proving to be extremely difficult, obviously, to do that. I mean, if you look at that Law 5, I think after it was passed, it took a few years even to get the first regulation out of it. So there were problems of trying to get the Law 5 into action, and there still, I think, are sort of profound problems on that. Once you start freeing up human resource management, then you can have the changes in culture, you can have the changes in sort of orientation from process to results which come with it. But it's very difficult. It's very difficult indeed. And so I'm sorry I can't give you a precise answer, but I can give you that. So yes, there has been progress. No, it's not going to be the world-class bureaucracy in 2025. It was always I would think, a very ambitious project, which, like many in this public administration reform project, underestimate the forces of resistance to change. And I have to add that any organizational change, whether it's in the public sector or the private sector, always encounters opposition. There's always someone, and it may be a lot of people, who see their interests threatened, they are scared of it, it promises an uncertain future. There are all sorts of reasons why people, they don't want to work in that new form, they don't like the new, or whatever it is. So you always get resistance, and it's about, as I said, the key I think now is to try and overcome. How do you overcome that? Well, it looks like the attack from the front has worked partially, but it's only getting these incremental changes that trying to persuade those who oppose is obviously, and also, mobilize, think of ways to mobilize the public service the citizens to demand change. So those are the ways forward. Difficult though.
Okay, so I will move to Diva first, and then to Mr. Abdurrahman. Diva, Mrs. Diva.
Okay. First, in the presentation of Professor Mark Turner, there is a two-way to understand the Indonesian bureaucracy. One of them is Max Weber ideal type, but as you said before, this type doesn't exist in reality. Why it could happen? Why could...
Bisa diulangi, Mbak, pertanyaannya?
Okay. There is two ways to understand the Indonesian bureaucracy. One of them is Max Weber ideal type, but this type, as you said before, this type doesn't really exist in reality. Why it could happen?
Okay, maybe so he's asking about more theoretical questions in regards to Max Weber ideals of bureaucracy. Okay, so maybe I will give to Mr. Abdurrahman first. Mr. Abdurrahman.
Okay, hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay. Which side about from and we now in Indonesia bureaucratic reform many challenge to goals concepts, but especially under to goals bureaucratic reform. How to minimize many challenges to make Indonesia better than anyway and better after day. Thanks.
Okay. So there has been a disruption in the signal, but I think he's asking about how to minimize the challenge that we have been facing over the last 3 decades.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, maybe 2 questions first, and then I will move to questions sent to me in the chat group.
So do you want me to answer those now, those 2?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, just the first one on the ideal types. There are 4. What we did was create our own ideal types. We use this device. It's an analytical device. It's a way in which you can classify information. So sort of put information together, organize it, and then analyze it. And so that's the reason we did this. It's sort of in order to make sense of reality, you need tools to do that. And the ideal type is a tool. So when we say Max Weber, he was the one who started the whole business of ideal types. However, in his work, he only really put together one ideal type, which was bureaucracy as the ideal type. What we've done is add 3 more ideal types, but using the general overall idea of Weber. Now, it doesn't matter that it doesn't exist in practice. What you're using it for is to compare what does exist in practice with the ideal type. The ideal type helps you to understand what actually exists and to say, yes, this organization conforms much more to the ideal type of bureaucracy than to the ideal type of new public management. However, there are elements of new public management in it. So you're able to analyze what are the components of the public service, we might say. Now, the second question to minimize the challenge. Well, what you have, I mean, we could take something like one of the most popular models of organizational change, which is Kotter. And at the start of that, Kotter advises you need to form a grand coalition. That is a powerful coalition that will push the organizational change through. Okay, now this was certainly done by both presidents since 2010. However, the opposition has obviously been much stronger than was anticipated. And so what are your options? Well, as basic strategies, you can either maintain the attack, maintain the pressure by pushing and pushing and pushing from the dominant coalition for more reform. So that's the one way, that's the frontal attack. You keep on doing that. And of course, what you need is still that the really powerful people are still right behind public administration reform, and they think it's a priority, and they make sure other people know that. So that's the fun. The other way is, okay, you've got this resistance. So what about talking to the resistance and getting the resistance to come on side with reform? Try to persuade them of the benefits rather than the threats, and try to get them to view it in a different way as opportunities. And the third way that I would say is try to, in various ways, mobilize pressure from society more generally, civil society groups, to put pressure on government, on public servants to reform. And so I think you've got to be working with all three at once. And I think they interact well. Citizens, we want more accountability, we want better services. The dominant coalitions trying to say, well, look, listen to this is more sensible doing this, persuading people, and then keep up the pressure with the reforms. So it's difficult, and it's difficult in any reform, whatever the organization, and however small, I might say as well. Some of the, I've seen sort of, the same thing can be played out in a non-governmental organization. You still have these sort of challenges. Okay.
Okay, I received 2 questions from the chat groups. This question is from Mr. Kandung Nugroho from Untirta, Banten. I think this question is asked yesterday, but I think today's participants are different. So comparing to Australia, which is a federal state, which one is better in handling COVID-19? So are there significant difference the way the public servants can be moved in federal state or in the democratic republic like us? Mm-hmm. And the second questions from the Veronica Wahyu Waskitaningrum. She's asking about a problem about the legal blockage. So what are the legal blockage, and are there any cases in Indonesia according to your research?
Okay. First of all, on the COVID-19. Now, I'm not going to do a sort of which is better, which is bigger, which is, you know, between Indonesia and Australia. What I say is I'll share with you how Australia, A, is organized, and B, what that means for the way in which we have addressed COVID-19. Now, as mentioned earlier, Australia is a federal state. So therefore, we have a national government and we have state governments, and there are 2 territories. Like Canberra is a territory which is similar to a state, but they have much smaller populations. Okay, the state governments have from the constitution, they have certain powers and authorities which have been devolved to them. You could call it decentralization, but it's not decentralization as in a unitary state like Indonesia. It is that they have these powers to do this. They are responsible for certain things, and the national government is responsible for other things. There are interrelationships. Okay, so what happened? So therefore, what happened in Australia is that the national government can't actually tell state governments what to do or force them to do it in certain areas of activity. But it can persuade them by various means. And so what the Prime Minister of the national government did was set up what we could call a unified approach, which incorporated both national and state leaders into it. And so what this was to try and get an approach across Australia rather than sort of having each state doing its own thing, to try and get a certain level of coordination. The national government could do things autonomously like, okay, we're shutting the borders to Australia. There's no more flights coming in. That's that. So the national government could do that. But say the state governments could do something else. They could say, right, here's the border between New South Wales and Queensland. And the Queensland government said, right, we're shutting that border. We're not having anybody. Western Australia shut all its borders with other states. So they have that. Implementing health is a state concern. So while there is an expert advisory panel at the national level, it is the states who implement health. They have the responsibility for the administration. They have the hospitals. They have all the nurses. They have all the doctors there. But what was trying to be done was to take advice from the national panel. What has happened is there's been a considerable degree of unity. This approach has worked, and people have generally been pretty good together and worked in sort of collaboration. But you do get some slight differences about, for instance, one at the moment, when the children return to school. Well, it's slightly different. You go to New South Wales, you go to Victoria, you go to ACT, Canberra, and it's a bit different. So you can find it's a bit different. Freeing up sort of how many people can meet together, that's been slightly different as well. So you get variations, but only small variations. Okay, but general, I mean, we still only have 99 deaths, I think, as of this morning from COVID. And one of the things is that the public service was flexible enough to completely change the way it operates. I mean, I have 2 daughter-in-laws and 1 son who work in the public service, and they're all working at home on the kitchen table at the moment. So you have to provide your own office, and they all come from different government departments as well. Okay. Oh, legal blockages. Yeah, the thing with the legal matters in Indonesia, as I see it, is that you can't have any action until you have a law, and then you don't have any action then until you have a regulation. So you can have a law and you pass, but you don't have any action until there's a regulation. Then there can be disputes about whether that regulation goes against this regulation or that law goes against this law. And so you can get into these disputes about who does what, who is responsible for what. Nobody is going to move, in my experience, in any government organization if there isn't a regulation or if there isn't a law. And so this tends to be what we would call a very bureaucratic way of operating. It's not that, say, in Australia, we have laws, we have regulations as well, but there's probably a much greater degree of flexibility and also collaboration between organizations, whereas laws and regulations can be used, if wanted to, by government departments anywhere, not necessarily Indonesia, can be used to stop things happening or to dispute whether other organizations are able to do this or able to do that. So it can be, it's something which has been noted by a variety of researchers and by sort of, I would say, the international agencies as well.
Okay, so I've got also one question from Doni Ermawan. So Doni is asking, decentralization has been one of the important indicators for bureaucratic reform. However, what happened right now, somehow in many parts of regions in Indonesia, decentralization has been quite difficult to implement by the regional governments, especially when they don't have quality human resources. And is there any possibility that to conduct bureaucratic reform to be more centralized again, in your opinion?
That would be that's an interesting question. That would be a matter for the central government in association with the decentralized governments. In many ways, there are degrees of central control. It's not that regional governments have a free hand to do things, that they're governed by national laws. And also, the HRM system really is a sort of a national system with the organizations in Jakarta, Personnel Agency, Kemenpan, and such like, and the Public Service Commission, all of these sort of in charge of that. Now, it's theoretically often possible to do anything. So could you centralize more? What my question would be is, if you centralize more, why should it get any better? And I think you have to, when you said, when proposals like this are made, is what are you trying to achieve? If you centralize, do you address the problem you see in those datas? Do you see that it's going to do that? The other thing is, are you taking a sledgehammer to something in which you take and go and say, right, we're going to centralize the whole lot of you in this reform, whereas there are kabupatens and kotas which are very capable and can look after themselves. Others may not be so good. So therefore, it's whether you want a variable approach, an adaptive approach to this, in which you have, you don't have a one-size-fits all. And the other thing, which is political, is I think if you trying to centralize, now that decentralization has become so embedded, is going to create opposition from out in the regions, and therefore it might be politically quite difficult to do. And you're always as a reformer, you do ask the question of, if we do this, will we have a lot of trouble, a lot of sort of negative feedback, opposition? Is it worth the while? So I would say that you would probably still have to go on working with within the decentralization framework, unless you create something which is an offer that the decentralized government can't refuse. So I think that would have to be it. Okay.
Okay. I still received some questions, but I will hold it for now. I'm sorry, because we need to move to the next presentations. However, you can also leave your questions in the chat feature. So I've got received notifications from the committee that there will be additional speaker for today, which is Dr. Kanti Pertiwi from Universitas Indonesia. So I will read her CV, just a quick review. So Dr. Kanti Pertiwi got PhD in Business and Economics at the University of Melbourne, specializing in organization studies and social change. She works at the Faculty of Economics and Business from Universitas Indonesia, Jakarta. And also she got experience working for the KPK, or the Corruption Eradication Commission in Indonesia. So without further ado, can I say hello to Dr. Kanti?
Ya, halo.
Dr. Kanti, can you hear? Okay.
Halo Mas Agi. Terima
Hello,
kasih.
Ibu. Thank you for giving us some presentations ya. So, Bu Kanti mau share screen?
Ya, boleh.
Oke. Saya persilakan gitu. Oke.
Thank you ya Bu Kanti for having time with us today.
Iya, thank you sama-sama to all organizers, Mbak Ika especially. Okay, can you all see my slide? Yes?
Yes.
See, yes, you can see it.
Okay. Okay. So, okay. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for the opportunity given to me this morning. Mbak Ika just contacted me this morning after a brief conversation yesterday. And I'm very excited to have this opportunity to share about my own research. And I have a couple of points that I really want to highlight after listening to Professor Mark Turner's presentation. Thank you, Professor. I think the point that you made about there's no one-size-fits-all approach to anti-corruption or reform for your topic, it cannot be more highlighted. I think it's a very important argument to make at this time. Okay, so thank you for the introduction, Mas Agi. I'll just introduce myself again quickly. My name is Kanti, and I'm a lecturer and researcher at Faculty of Economics and Business, Universitas Indonesia. Also an honorary fellow at University of Melbourne, where I did my PhD, graduated in 2017. So my presentation today will be about contextualizing anti-corruption and bureaucratic reform. Okay, so what do I mean by contextualizing? I'll take you through it. So this is just a bit about my background. I have previously worked for the Indonesian Anti-Corruption Commission, and that was the first time. The first time I became very interested with the issue of corruption, and when I had the opportunity to do my PhD, I decided to look at this issue. And the title of my thesis was But That's Not Corruption, an interpretive approach to corruption in business-government relations in Indonesia. And my work currently looks at still corruption, ethics, governance, and also gender topics. Okay, so just to give you some context, because we are talking about contextualizing something. So the context of my presentation is that I have been working at this issue, corruption, and I have some publications. The most recent one is the one published in Integritas Maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's the journal managed by the KPK, the Corruption Eradication Commission. And the latest work that I published discussed the discrepancies in Indonesia's anti-corruption discourse between dominant and alternative discourses of corruption. So dominant and alternative will explain, I will explain more further in my presentation. And the other work that I would like to promote is also a book titled Geliat Kritis Penelitian Sosial di Indonesia, Catatan Para Peneliti. It was published by Yayasan Obor Indonesia. And I also talked about my approach in studying corruption, which can be classified as a critical approach to corruption, so part of critical corruption studies. It's a small but growing literature looking at corruption in different parts of the world. Okay, so how can we study corruption? So the mainstream approach to corruption, to studying corruption, I label it as the traditionalist approach. So the traditionalist approaches usually view corruption as something that is objective and universal, and actors who are involved in corruption are rationally motivated. So they want to maximize their personal gain, personal benefit, and that the intervention that we need to have is to educate people so that they will be able to recognize, to differentiate between what is corruption and what is not corruption. So there's this wrong and right approach, okay? So there's the wrong and right understanding of corruption, and people are supposed to be educated to understand the right version, the right definition, the correct interpretation. Okay, so the other approach, which is my approach in my research, is called the discursive approach. It views corruption as socially constructed, it is situated, and it is embedded in social relations. And this is the assumption that is pretty much shared by researchers that work in this tradition, and their work can be classified as critical corruption research or critical corruption studies, and this is where I situate my research. Okay, so this is the sort of the front runner of anti-corruption in Indonesia, the KPK, with their slogan "Berani Jujur Hebat." Yeah, we all know that. And I want to look at this as sort of the dominant perspective or the dominant understanding, the dominant discourse of corruption. What's in this dominant discourse? There is this definition, corruption as the abuse of public office power for private gain. And this is sort of in the critical tradition or the critical literature, it will be sort of problematized. Okay, so there are writers such as Bukovansky who said that the public and private dichotomy is not universal. So it cannot be applied to all contexts, all cultures. So it's very important to examine all the assumptions, each of the assumptions that form this dominant discourse of corruption, to look at what are the weaknesses. Okay, so why doesn't anti-corruption work, for example, in Indonesia? And then we also see dominant discourse, we can see it in the media. So looking at, for example, one of my papers currently that I'm working on is looking at television programs, a very a highly, what do you call it? It was a famous television program, Mata Najwa, and also the newspaper like Kompas and also Jakarta Post. Jakarta Post especially is part of my PhD research, so looking at how the media talk about corruption. Okay, so this is very important because then this will influence how people, policymakers, everyday people like you and me view corruption, understand corruption. Okay, and then the dominant discourse of corruption also often talks about the identity of business people versus government agents, in which business people are often seen as more ethical, more professional, more, what do you call it, more creative, more productive, more accountable, whereas government agents are mostly constructed as the incompetent other. Okay, so this is some of interesting findings in the dominant discourse of corruption. And then I'll move on to this idea of anti-corruptionism. This is part of my presentation in maybe last month's discussion series with the community of bureaucrats in Jakarta mainly, and also in other parts of Indonesia. So I put forward this argument of anti-corruptionism, which is, I borrowed this from Sampson, 2014, who argued that anti-corruptionism is a form of global anti-corruption regime, consists of policy instruments, ideologies, programs, practices, promises that if you do certain things, you will be able to cure corruption. You will be able to be more developed. You will be able to be an advanced country. So this is the argument that is being made through anti-corruptionism, and this views corruption. This views these concepts as universally applicable, even though it is inseparable from the experience of mostly the global North countries. So this is the criticism that these critical corruption scholars have made, and I think it's a very important argument that we have to sort of take into account whenever we research corruption, or even maybe give lectures on corruption, or in our everyday understanding and our everyday conversations. So if we want to bring it to our current challenges in the pandemic, the situation of pandemic, bureaucrats fear criminalization, and this has relations with the strong regime or the hegemonic regime of anti-corruptionism. So bureaucrats become slow in responding because they're afraid they will be making the wrong decisions and they will be prosecuted a year after this pandemic has sort of subsided. Okay, so going back to my own research, my PhD research at Melbourne University applies discourse analysis as a methodology, and I looked at what corruption means in Indonesia. So my question was very basic, because I see that there's a gap between the dominant discourse of corruption, how it's being talked about in amongst policymakers, especially, with how it is understood by people in everyday life, including bureaucracy, right? So I want to study, what does it mean? Okay, so the literature tells me that we need to look at how individuals interpret corruption, because we cannot generalize experiences of corruption. That's why I took an interpretive approach. I did my fieldwork in Jakarta in 2014, and I interviewed approximately 40 participants made of people from government, also business people, and also anti-corruption actors. Okay, some of my findings, I think the most interesting one will be the meaning of corruption itself. What does corruption mean to you? So I've listed down all these different words. Okay, so the important element of discourse analysis is language. So the centrality of language, how people use words, how people use language, how what sort of expressions they have to talk about corruption. So it's interesting that people use a lot of words like kasih. Kasih, if you look at it from a language perspective, kasih means love, right? So it's really about this human connection, understanding others' situation, understanding others sort of limitations, if you want to put it that way. But also there are these other negative terms that people use, like nyetor, or maybe nyuap, or palak, or even nakal, or sogok, yeah? So these different nuances of corruption represent the different ways that people understand corruption. Okay, so after my fieldwork, I went back to Australia, and then I tried to sit down with my panel of research supervisors and try to get down to the meanings. Okay, so from all the different narratives of corruption. What are the most salient meanings? So I have to say that these three meanings that I'm about to explain, they're not, what do you call it, exhaustive. There are possibly other meanings out there, but for the sake of my study, I have to put limitations and give emphasis to certain meanings only. And I've decided on three most salient meanings. The first one is that corruption gets things done. The second one is corruption preserves livelihoods. And the third one is that corruption maintains social relations and obligations. Okay, so what are the examples for this meaning? Corruption gets things done. So basically, this meaning is about how people understand certain practices that are commonly labeled as corruption. It's basically to get things done, to help the government work, to support under budget governments, and then they look at it from a practical, pragmatic perspective. So it has nothing to do with morality, but it's about practicality. So for example, here Jaya, who is a private employee, said to me, we as foreign investors, we want to import. Our core business is in downstream. Without import record from the government, we cannot do any of the work. So we have to accommodate all the under the table stuff. So whatever they ask, we provide. So this is some of the examples that my informants are giving me when they narrate corruption. Why do they engage in corruption? Why can't they stop corruption? It's because it helps government work, it supports government work, it helps get things done. And the second meaning is corruption preserves livelihood. So if this is something, has something to do with remuneration, the salary that public officials receive. And my understanding is that after the bureaucratic reform, I think in some ministries, they have experienced a huge increase in salary. And with Tunkin, of course, Tunjangan Kinerja, but this is not shared by all of the other sort of public officials. So there is sort of this partially implemented solutions, which is part of the criticism. So for example, my informants said, if we go back to the system, for instance, the police has a salary of 5 million rupiahs. Is it enough? So he will be seeking for additional income, or sampingan, some people call it. It gets terrifying when they go overboard. So you can see that from this narrative from Sudi. Sudi is an anti-corruption promoter. So this is all pseudonyms. I don't use actual names. So even for an anti-corruption promoters, they can understand, okay? So they can understand why public officials still take bribes, for example. It's because they don't have enough salary and they need that income to to make up the gap in their salary, right? So that's the second meaning. And the third meaning is that corruption maintains social relations and obligations. So this is an example from Awan, who's a private employee. He said that if you live in a village, you want to build a lavish mansion, but the surrounding is still poor, we will create social tensions. So what is he talking about here? So as a business person, as a businessman, as a profit organization who's making a lot of money, and you look at your surroundings, there are people who make much less than you. You will be obligated to share the bounties that you receive. Okay, so an example that he gave was that as part of the halves, if there's the celebration of the 17th of August, Independence Day, Hari Kemerdekaan, and the head of district or the head of region, whatever, if they need something, they don't need to say anything. Just by the look of their eye, we have to respond. We have to support, whatever. So this is just a small example, which I think encapsulates all the complexities in corruption, all the complexities of the different practices that outsiders often call corruption, but to insiders, it means something else. Okay, so this is another example. this is also coming from a business, I think it's a business owner, Rama, and he said that if his business is successful, his business idea really takes off, he believes that you should share what you get. Okay, although it's not an obligation, you should consider it infak or sedekah. Okay, so it's part of the business conduct in Indonesia. These cultural meanings are often ignored. It's not often taken seriously in the dominant discourse of anti-corruption, and this is becoming sort of a serious obstacles in the implementation of various reform programs, because there are cultural meanings that are being ignored and being downplayed. And for KPK, I experienced this myself, we would normally call this the wrong interpretation. This is a mistake to interpret this way. So we have to try to correct people's interpretations. So that has been the goal for the past 2 decades, and I don't think it's working. I believe it's not working because we can see that these practices are still continuing. Okay, so multiple meanings of corruption. Are there any other ways that we can look at meanings of corruption? We can look at media discourse, what's being talked about in the media. For example, there's this article that says, in the case of Lukman, the Menteri Agama, Lukman Saifuddin, there's bisharoh. Yeah, bisharoh means happiness. Okay, so it's money that is being shared as an expression of sharing happiness. So these cultural meanings are important and needs to be acknowledged and needs to be looked at in context. So for example, the context for this will be our political party financing. Okay, so this is a huge problem that has not been addressed until this very day, and it keeps coming up as a problem in our bureaucracy and also amongst our politicians, because there is no sort of reliable system to fund or to finance political parties in Indonesia. And there's another article by tirto.id, which is interesting. Also, they collected these different terms from different parts of the world that signify corruption. And this is very interesting because then it tells you about how people live their lives, what sort of social fabrics that people have in their communities, in their societies, how things work, and how do they perceive each other's rights and obligations, duties and obligations. Okay, going to the discussion, I would like to emphasize here is that corruption has different meanings in different contexts, and that studying corruption requires a contextual understanding of the different practices, and especially the underlying meaning and identities that shape those practices. So you have to ask, what does this mean according to these people in these communities? What sort of identities they bring into their understanding of these practices? Okay, and then there's another point that is, I think, very interesting from the literature of sociology. I'm not sure if there's anyone from sociology department here or anthropology, because the discourse or the discursive approach in corruption and studying corruption borrows heavily from sociology and also anthropology. So in sociology, that recently have begun to look at situated morality. That morality is plural. One act or one practice that is seen as moral can be seen as something entirely different by other people. So this is something that anti-corruption research and activists need to look at. And then if we want to go deeper into how do bureaucrats construct their identity, or even society? How does society in Indonesia construct the identity of the bureaucrats? So this is part of my other papers, which looked at the construction of identities of bureaucrats in online chat forums. So I collected conversations from kaskus.com. Any of you here a user of Kaskus? Maybe you're familiar with the threads and the discussions. There are various discussions that you can find in Kaskus, and it's a very interesting way to study meanings and practices social practices, how identities are constructed. So what I found is that there's this particular construction of identity of the bureaucrats that really suggests that they're the other of society. They're the unwanted section of society. They're the incompetent. They're the unwanted ones. Why is that? Where does this come from? This doesn't come from nowhere. Okay, so it comes from somewhere. There's this understanding, this view that bureaucrats are inherently corrupt. Okay, it's very interesting here. Kalau jadi PNS itu berhasil tidak dipuji, gagal dicaci maki, hilang tidak dicari, kaya dicurigai, miskin salah sendiri. So I've presented this in many forums. It's very interesting that people would laugh about it, but none of them would disagree. They would laugh because they think it's true. They share this understanding. Okay. Okay, so I agree with Professor Turner when he said that reform strategy cannot be a one-size-fits-all. Especially, it cannot be derived from the experience of global North countries. So you have to look at all these different practices that outsiders will view as problematic from the inside. So you look at it from the inside. You look at the meanings and identities underlying these various practices. And if you you're questioning why is the bureaucracy not responsive, because the concepts that this anti-corruption reforms bring, I would say they are alien concepts, and they're not rooted in local values and local meanings and everyday practices. So people don't recognize them, like public and private dichotomy. This is not universal. This is not universal. So you have to look at from the perspective of the insiders, from the community that you study, from the community that you seek to enhance their lives, you seek to enhance their practices or to bring betterment to these communities, especially in addressing inequalities, inadequate pay, and partial remuneration. So certain ministries have much better pay than others. This is another issue that I really want to look at in my future research. What is the problem? Why is this the case? Okay, why does people accept that certain ministries are entitled to better pay and then other ministries are not? Okay, and then of course there is the issue of party financing problems, where politicians are continuing to to take advantage of our bureaucrats. Okay, take advantage of our bureaucrats because the bureaucrats are the ones who manage the budget, who organize activities, and this has become an ongoing problem because there's no currently there's no final solution to this problem. And also, the moralist approach is not useful, as I've stated before. Morality is plural. Morality can mean different things to different people. And the final one is to revisit the use of the term corruption, because based on some of the research in the critical corruption literature, they argue that corruption is an empty signifier, meaning that different people can assign different meanings to it, depending on their agenda and their interests. Okay, finally, I think this is an important point to make. There's an article in The Guardian a couple of years ago from Jeffrey Sachs. It was from the Anticorruption Summit, where he said that to end corruption, we really need to look at the practices in the US and the UK because they allow it in broad daylight. So this means that you can put different meanings to corruption. And sometimes in our context, our corruption becomes a bigger problem than other countries' corruption. It's basically because of the dominant discourse say so, because the dominant actors say so. And there's a theory, there's a very famous statement from Robert Cox, 1981, that says every theory is for someone and for some purpose. And for myself, as a corruption researcher, I would argue that we need to look at corruption from the perspective of the marginalized. And in this case, it's most often that the marginalized are the bureaucrats. I think that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Kanti, for the inspiring presentations. I become obviously PNS this year, so I've been wondering of myself whether if my condition suits with your presentations, ya. Serba
Okay.
salah ya.
Mudah-mudahan berubah ya dalam waktu dekat ya, Mas.
Yes, this is very interesting because the presentations about the corruption, this is not only about traditional approach, but also coming from different perspectives. Even with the move of our eyes, it indicates we want something from the people that we want to serve.
Yes,
Okay, maybe,
never underestimate the power of everyday conversations. Yeah.
Okay, I will give first to Bu Ika for giving some welcoming speech to everyone attending today.
Okay, thank you, Agi, and everyone. And once again, thank you to Prof Mark Turner for the session today. Hope you're not too tired, yeah, Prof. And you're still excited, of course. I can see from your participation, from your presentation, and also for the Kanti. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you today. For everyone also who have great participants in today's session, and hopefully I can see you again in tomorrow's session. And I would like to highlight why this second session I invited my colleagues from the University of Melbourne when we did PhD together. We have an impression and also an argument that bureaucratic reform was initially perceived as only ending corruption, as well as providing better remuneration for the bureaucracy. That's why I thought that learning or discussing about corruption is one of important affair and issues that we should discuss. And also, we like always behind or like getting slow progress in lots of aspects of development, public administration, and public policy or public service affair are also due to KKN, yeah, corruption, collusion, and nepotism, which is our like basic illness. Yeah, that's why today corruption will hopefully give us insight why Indonesia keep on doing corruption. Not only like the bureaucrat is sometimes corrupt, but also the community, like the whole Indonesia. And we can discuss that's all in this discussion session. And I will give back to Mr. Agi so that you can have your discussion. Thank you, Agi.
Okay, we still have 30 minutes before ending our sessions. So I've got questions from Muhammad Reza. He's asking about in Indonesia, there are 34 provinces, and it's quite difficult to use, as argued, as our presenters argue, there will be no one size fits all. Is there any way that we can cope with this issue about inequality, about the lacking of quality of human resources? And there is also issue about public trust. So he wants to ask your comment about that. Maybe is there any country that also have different characteristic of provinces, of states, and how they cope with bureaucratic reform?
Is that for me or?
Yes. Also, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, everybody wants to ask question, please use raise hand feature, yeah, or you can chat me privately.
I'll respond to that. Yes, I mean all countries are divided into subnational territories. It varies from where you are. If you're in the Philippines, it's provinces, smaller provinces generally than in Indonesia. Then it's municipalities, it's cities as well. If you go to so we can go to any of the countries you go to in the region, in the world, has subnational territories. Also, you'll generally find that there are inequalities between regions and within regions as well. That And so the way in which so what it is decentralization is sometimes there's a sort of hypothesis, we might say, that, or question, does decentralization increase inequality? Because of course some are better able to help themselves than others because they have much higher resources in terms of finance, in terms of human resources and such like. But then if we go to bureaucratic reform, it depends on, again, what the subnational government system is. If you have a unitary state, then it's likely that the bureaucratic reform will be across all of the state. So this will be local as well. But then you have to look more closely and say, well, do they have more authority here in the UK at the local level, or do they have more authority there? One of the things also, where do they get their finance from? Within Indonesia, a lot of it is transfer from the centre. In some places you might find they have the sort of greater taxing power, and this gives often greater independence. Again, we go back to the no one size fits all. It's different wherever you go, and you have to sort of look at what the particular circumstances are of A, countries and the national arrangements, and then B, with the way in which the inequalities which exist and why they exist, because they don't necessarily exist for one reason or just two reasons across everywhere. There'll be a variety of reasons why such inequalities do exist. In Australia, we have inequalities within states, certainly, and between states maybe as well, certain times. So, I mean, it's, as I say, it's different everywhere, and one has to look at the specific circumstances of a country and its divisions.
Okay, right. So I will move to the next question. So I will move it quickly, so make sure everyone get the same chance. This question is from Nia Putri Antoro. She's asking to Professor Mark Turner as well. How is the implication of temporary worker in Australia? Is the salary paid per hour or per month? Is there any implication about this? And she's also wondering whether are there any weaknesses in implementing the new public management in Indonesia? And also, I also have a question. It's from me actually, maybe to the both speakers. In your paper, the final statement is something like this. Indonesia haven't really been using the underutilized resource in Indonesia, which is the public. So what can the public do for the bureaucratic reform? What can the ordinary people do, like us, to prevent corruptions? Are there any significant improvements that a public can have to influence how the decision-making process happening in bureaucratic reform and corruptions?
Okay, the salaries of temporary workers. Now, by this, I'm assuming you mean temporary workers in government, or is it temporary workers full stop, from, across all sectors? I don't know quite what that means there. I can answer it for partially for government. When government wants temporary workers, it will contract them, and so they will have contracts for fixed terms generally. And so this is often done through a recruitment agency. So the recruitment agency acts as an intermediary between government and the worker, and so seeking a job. So you might say that a government will, a department may have the need for 5 people with particular qualifications for 6 months to do a particular task, and so they will give contracts for that period. They will hire them. There's also the case, which is different than Indonesia. There is a lot of work which is contracted out in Australian government. So great use is made of consulting companies and companies outside of the public sector to do work in the public sector or for the public sector. And so here you have, I mean, in organizational terms, you have an interesting question about, well, if this is the, I'll give you a concrete example. I'm currently also teaching a group of officers in master's degree from the Navy, and talking about organizational change and leadership. Now, so the Navy, you see, there's an armed force, quite clear where the boundaries of that organization are. But many of these guys, they work, they're not necessarily on ships, they're working on sort of other aspects, and they work with public servants and they work with private sector individuals. So then you say, well, what's the Navy? Does it include the public and the sort of public servants and the private sector? And so what? So we have, so both temporary workers are hired and also work, a lot of work. Billions of dollars work is contracted out each year. Oh, no, that's me done, yeah, is it? Or that's the answer to that one? Oh, the public sector reform.
The public. Yeah, I mean the how the public, the ordinary people can play a role.
How do you get the public to mean? Well, I mean the ways in doing this. I mean, I can't give you a precise way, but the idea is, you ask yourself, how can the public put pressure on government to reform the public service? Well, it won't go into an abstraction like, you know, you're not going to have public, you know, we're, you know, for public administration reform. That's too divorced from reality. What it is putting pressure on for the improvement of services generally, because that's what people are concerned about. Improvement on that, improvement on accountability. These are the sorts of things which people may be interested. Now, they may be interested, but they may be like a sort of a load of free-flowing atoms that they need to get together. So you need to get people together to express their interests, to put forward their interests. And that's the thing. Civil society is the obvious sort of vehicle for this. And a strong civil society holds governments to account, or can hold governments to account. And again, this puts pressure on government. And especially in a democratic regime, when there's the people who are in office have an ambition to get re-elected mostly. Now, and to sort of show that they do good performance. If the public put pressure on them, then maybe they then sort of elevate public administration reform to a higher priority. So it's, you know, there's different ways of doing this, but it's about sort of where can, and identifying where pressure points are, where you can sort of have an impact on that.
Mm. Okay, before I move to Dr. Kanti, I've got two questions for you in my private chat. So the first question from Farida Hanum. Is there any huge gap between civil servant and private worker? Because according to your research, that make them have some mindsets that you have quoted in your presentation. And there is also a question from M. Akbar. Maybe she's asking about the reformasi di korupsi, reform corrupted. Because maybe some people say that in Jokowi administration, KPK is being murdered, because the recent law, the revised law about the KPK. So is there any probability someday in the future the problematics of corruption will be completely eliminated? Because you know, at this stage that the new revised KPK and then the new elected head of KPK, which is from the police that have special issues on ethics. Well, how can you see the future of corruption prevention and eradication?
Okay. Yeah, makasih. Thank you, Mas Agi. I forgot who asked these questions, but the first one was about is there a huge gap in terms of the salary of people in the business sector and the government sector? I haven't done the research, like systematically looking at how much people are getting, how receiving, but this is based on public discourse, okay? What people are saying in public space, for example, in the media, in online conversations. But my understanding is that in general, the private sector has a better standard of pay, compared to the government sector. Okay, so this is what contributes to the understanding that business people have to share their wealth, have to share their bounty. So business people are often seen as the rich cousin of government, and government becomes the poor cousin of business. And this is unique to Indonesia. I don't think I have seen this in Australia. Maybe Professor Turner can share his observations. If people in government in Australia, are they seen as poor cousins to the business or something else? And then the second question about reformasi di korupsi. Actually, I always see this case that we have with the anti-corruption law being amended, and some people argue that this is actually pelemahan. It's corruptors fighting back. So these corruptors are trying to weaken the KPK and weaken the anti-corruption law. My question is instead, why is that so? All of these years, the past 2 decades, anti-corruption has enjoyed so much, consensus. Okay, there's no disagreement whatsoever. But now we're beginning to see even law professors are criticizing the KPK. So I think the KPK needs to be able to take criticisms. Okay, so the KPK cannot be immune to criticism. That's for one. And number two, we can not assume any longer that the KPK always acts in the best interest of the Indonesian people. Okay, because there's lots of cases where anti-corruption laws are being used to bring down political opponents. Okay, so it's being used by people to bring down their opponents. It's being used to blackmail people. So we can no longer see anti-corruption law and anti-corruption instruments as neutral. Okay, so there are certain people, certain actors, institutions who take benefit from their operations and activities and programs. And we as academics and researchers and students, you have to be critical in looking at this, studying this, examining this, comparing between the dominant discourses and alternative discourses. What are the discourses that are being marginalized, being ignored, being put aside? And that's when we can have an institution that really represents the interests of the people. Thank you.
Maybe some comments about condition in Australia, Prof, regarding civil servants in Australia.
Yeah, there isn't a perception, I don't think, of civil servants being poor cousins to the private sector. Several observations. Well, first of all, that's the basic one. They're not seen as poor cousins. That's not a widespread view. There can be antagonism towards public servants in the sense by people who feel that they're not getting, as what we say, a fair go, a fair deal in society, and that public servants are sometimes they're not in touch with reality. So you get that sort of critique coming, especially from those who feel that they've had a bad deal in life and from the government. When you come to look at actual salary regimes, three things probably. First of all, within the private sector, you can get quite different salary regimes. And so some people in the private sector will not be paid as much as public servants, that's for sure. whereas there are other areas of the public sector, of the private sector, especially at the upper levels, which get paid a vast amount of money. But it varies quite dramatically. And if I'm trying to think of some things I've seen on this, I think you might find on average, the public servants may get paid slightly more if you take the average over the lot there. So no, interestingly, within the federal national public service, we have, like Speaker was saying, we have different pay scales in different organizations. And this actually is part of the new public management reforms, in which they delegate the authority, saying, here's your budget, now you spend it, because here's your performance indicators, you've got to achieve these, here's your budget, now you decide what you're going to pay. And so it's delegated down. And so what you then end up with is, and it's not surprising in the least, is that the institutions with us, Treasury, Ministry of Finance, they're separate in Australia. So Treasury, Ministry of Finance, Foreign Affairs, Defence will generally have much higher salaries, or the highest salaries. And then you ask yourself, which have the least power? Cultural institutions. So places like the National Gallery, sort of certain organizations devoted to, say, Aboriginal culture, they have very much lower salaries. And I should add that when you're in the upper ranks of the public service in a state or the national level, doesn't matter which, the salaries are extraordinarily high. You know, you'd certainly be getting the very top public servants would earn 600,000 Australian dollars a year, which is big by anybody's standards. Okay.
Thank you very much, Prof Turner, for the answer. So we've got 5 minutes left. Is there any participant who still wants to ask questions?
Can I ask?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe sorry if I didn't follow just now because I have an urgent phone call. But I would like to ask to my dear colleagues, Kanti. I know that it's not gonna be there gonna be no absolute true answer for this. But maybe as a scholar who have dealing so much with corruption, do you have a prescription for ending corruption in Indonesia, or at least eliminate this slowly? Or because it's like we have a rooted corruption, yeah, in Indonesia, that it's so difficult for us to end. And then for Prof Mark Turner, could I ask the position of governance, Prof? Because we have moved to the new governance reform, and then new public governance, which actually has to be incorporated in the reform of bureaucracy in Indonesia. And how the new public governance influence in Indonesian bureaucratic reform, for example, as far as I concern, like for digital revolution, for example, it's already incorporated in Indonesia in many areas of public service, and then in public service innovation, or any public administration affairs, yeah, such as like we have a national complaint handling system, lapor, and then the government also has tried to initiate like one data policies or one map policy in which we use such digital revolution. But for the governance, can you explore more about new public governance in the place of public administration reform in Indonesia, Prof Turner? Thank you. Agi, do you have more?
Ya, langsung aja ya.
Yes,
Langsung
yeah.
aja.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. It's okay, Mas Agi. A recipe for success for anti-corruption in Indonesia. there should be a long answer to this, but if you want me to give a short answer, ya Mbak Ika, ya, it's to address inequality. I think that's the recipe.
Address inequality, yeah.
Inequality is the problem. So if you want to reallocate all the resources of campaigning, berani, jujur, hebat, but it's not relatable to people. You rather use that money to educate, to pay for schools, to pay for teacher salary, to build their competence. So it's many of the problems in our bureaucracy. It's not simply about morality, or even not about morality at all, but it's about incompetence. So you need to develop the bureaucrats, give them trainings, and most importantly, to give them a fair salary. So for example, I just remember now the accountants, this is a colleague of mine who shared this information. Accountants in government institutions, she compared that an accountant with 10-year experience working for 3 different government institutions will receive different take-home pay. So there's one that receives 9 million rupiahs, 9 juta, and then there's another one that receives 15 million rupiahs, and then the third one that receives 25 million rupiah. So all of them work for government institutions, same experience, 10 years of experience. So how can they, each of them, receive different take-home salary? That's a big question. And not to mention, if you compare it, 10-year experience in the accounting industry, in the private sector, I'm pretty sure the number would be beyond that, maybe 30, 35 million rupiahs. So this huge gap, inequality is a problem. Thank you.
Inequality is a problem, yeah. Okay. So it's more long-term effort, yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yes, there's no quick fix. Absolutely,
yeah.
yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Maybe I think that's already 12:30. Yeah. Maybe I will close this meeting immediately, because the Zoom meeting will be used for other classes. So before closing our event for today, I would like to inform that tomorrow there will be one more session from Prof Mark Turner. He will talk about leadership, leadership, especially in dealing in COVID-19. I've also got notification from the committee that the previous code for the Zoom meeting for tomorrow will be changed. So I will give you email after this about the new code, so you can participate tomorrow. And for those asking about material slides, we will, don't worry, we will provide you after tomorrow session over. We will send by email about the slides, about the journals, about the recorded lectures that we have been conducting for 3 days. So make sure you put your email correctly in our form. Okay, thank you. Maybe, Wika, is there anything else that you want to say to participants?
I think that's all from me. And thank you very much again for Prof Mark Turner for your time and your insight of this Bureaucratic Reform in Indonesia. It's so comprehensive, which I myself who teach Bureaucratic Reform in Indonesia, like, oh my God, you have covered everything. Thank you very much. And again, one more for Dek Kanti Pertiwi, thank you very much. Ya, jadi mendadak, Mbak, you made it, and it was so comprehensive explanation of corruption. I really eager to have you with us, since we are really have a problem of corruption in Indonesia. Like every day we know, like siapa ya yang ketangkap tangan gitu ya. Cuman karena it just because of this COVID and pandemic, then that issue stopped.
Yeah, it's the different interpretation, Mbak.
Yeah.
Problem with interpretation as well. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you, Pak Agi.
Terima kasih.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Prof Mark
Thank
Turner, Bu Kanti, Bu Ika, everybody.
Thank you, ya. Budu, thank you, one of our great committee.
Tomorrow, Prof Mark Turner will be moderated by Mr. Putu. Mr. Putu, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you for the time. Mas Aki. Okay, Professor Turner, tomorrow you will get your time with me in the webinar, the same webinar. Okay, yes.
And you'll send me the new meeting, whatever
Yes,
it
yes.
is.
I will send you immediately after this.
Okay.
Yes,
So
Prof, so
because
that we can cover like 300 participants
Yes.
rather than only 100. You know, like
Yes.
yesterday, Prof, it was only 100 limit for the participant, and many messages come to me, my personal message, say, oh, it's already reached the quota and I can get in, I cannot get in. So like everyone adore you here in Indonesia, Prof. They really know your book.
More popular than in Australia.
They always, hey, Prof Mark Turner is the one who authored those state and administration, yeah, and development, and then you have the second version,
Yes.
like the governance and development, yeah. So
Yeah.
everyone love you, so they really looking forward to what your session tomorrow again. So
Yes.
hope
At
you're
this
not
point,
boring, Prof.
yeah.
Hope you're not boring and not get too tired. That's why we try to get like second presenter. As this was our discussion with our dean, and our dean asked. Our dean is from our department as well. So Dr. Yes, Associate Professor Pales ID is the Dean of Faculty of Social and Political Science. He want to join tomorrow actually, but then urgent meeting came up. So again tomorrow he will not able to say hello to you, but it's okay next time. And yeah, and the message from our team is, maybe it's good idea if you find a partner for Prof Mark Turner, so not like the whole time Prof Mark Turner has to do the lecture by himself. That's why I have another presenter, and hopefully provide more insight as well to our participants. Yeah, hope you don't mind, yeah, Prof. Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, at this point, already 425 participants registered.
For what?
So hopefully,
Tomorrow?
yeah. For the whole session, for 3 sessions, already 425. So lots of people that we cannot cover, who couldn't cover yesterday. So tomorrow the maximum will be 300.
Everyone, you agree with me that we adore Professor Mark Turner for his publication, his research, yeah, and his insightful views and like comprehensive of Indonesian affair. Like, it's great. Anyone wanna say hello to? I thought we have end up.
Or maybe we can take selfie, yeah. like yesterday.
Everyone.
Please, everyone, please turn on your camera.
Yes.
So I will take screenshots from here. Anyone, please. Wait. Okay, hang on a second. Okay, we'll take a screenshot. 1. Okay, everybody, I'm still waiting. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Kanti tadi mana? Are you there, Dek Kanti? Your video, Dek Kanti.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay, thank you everyone.
Okay.
Thank you, Prof. I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay, terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak, Prof.
Terima kasih, thank you.
Pak Abdurrahman, terima kasih ya.
Oh, Ibu.
Iya. Thank you.
Selamat siang, Bu.
Okay. Mas Yagi, you can end the meeting now and I'll see you everyone tomorrow ya.
Okay.
Terima kasih Bapak Ibu semua. Terima kasih banyak sudah partisipasi.
Terima kasih.